Okay. Now it's interesting because in reality, if you look through the Jewish sources, you look through the Chumash, you look through the 5 books of Moses, even if you look through the Talmud, there's really very little mention of the Jewish philosophy or really Jewish thought as to exactly what happens when a person passes on. There's really very, very little mention of it. And the classic commentators have given 2 main reasons for this. Number 1, because Judaism is a religion for life. That when, as we say in the Shema prayer, that if a person observes the commandments properly and fears God and loves God, God will reward us in this world, not in the afterlife where no one's ever been, but here and now. That we have to realize that the Torah and Judaism is not only a fairy tale that, and like you'll tell children, you'll get a reward in a long time, may not get it. But the point is that for keeping a Torah lifestyle, not only will God reward us, but we'll live a better life in this life itself, number 1. Number 2, another reason why there is not so much mention of death is because typically both the Bible and the Talmud is really meant for everyone. It's meant to be user-friendly. It's meant to be something that's accessible to everyone. Whereas, as we'll see, that many of the topics we speak about today are really from Kabbalah, or really from the more mystical or esoteric works. So in reality, those are the works meant for the select few. The Torah is something that everyone can comprehend and everyone can relate to. Since some of the things we may mention today are a little bit lofty, and I'm not scared about that, but that's another reason why they aren't necessarily mentioned in the Torah. But again, to make it very clear that everything that we'll be talking about tonight is something that we're going through authentic sources, Torah sources, and as well as whenever there's scientific evidence to back anything up, I will certainly do my best in order to go ahead and present that scientific evidence. Okay. So before we get into how does Judaism look at death and what happens after we die, we have to ask a much more basic question. The question we have to ask is, well, what's life about? Before we talk about death, what's life about? Why are we here? What exactly is it why exactly is it that God created us? Why were we put on planet Earth? So I'm going to take my first pause right here and ask everyone, if you had to answer, maybe one at a time, why are we here? Why are we created? Why did God put us on this beautiful earth? Please, anyone.
I think take a stab at it. To do good things for others, be helpful to others.
My thought was maybe along the same line, to make it a better world, to complete it. God did not necessarily finish the world, but he put us here to do the finishing. We're not doing a great job all the time.
I posted in the chat, but I would say to glorify.
You have to unmute yourself, Rabbi.
There we go. Thank you. So like this, someone else put there to glorify God's name. Okay. So just to go back before that, Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twersky once mentioned a very beautiful insight that the verse states when God created man, it said, let us make man, right? Let us make man. The question is, who is God speaking to? Judaism is a monotheistic religion. Who's God speaking to? And some explain that God was speaking to the angels and asking permission and to show the concept of humility. However, Rabbi Dr. Twersky answered differently. He said beautifully, he said like this, you know who God was speaking to? God was speaking to each and every man and woman. God is speaking to mankind and saying, let us make man. Together, I'm going to give you the potential. I'm going to give you the raw powers to go ahead and do things. Let us make man, that mankind will in fact partner with God in creating the ultimate man and creating the ultimate world. And I'll tell you like this, when I was a kid in school, I used to always get bothered when teachers would ask a question and would solicit answers. And the teacher always had an answer they had in mind. And no matter what the answers were, they say, oh, that's a nice answer to that, but why don't you think about this? So everyone's answer was a great answer. But I want to share a different thing, a different thought, and take the conversation a little bit differently. A good lawyer only asks questions which he knows answers to, right? So I kind of figured all the answers everyone said. In fact, the most common answer usually given is tikkun olam, to prepare the world. And the reason why, I guess philosophically, I wouldn't necessarily give that answer is because that makes it sound like the world is the essence of creation as opposed to mankind, man and woman. Creating the world's a great place, but the world is not the pinnacle of creation. Each individual human being is the pinnacle of creation. The creation of the world was for mankind, not for the world is a vehicle in which mankind can live, can improve, can better, right? But that's not the essence of creation. The essence creation is mankind. So what I'd like to do is, and what I'm going to do throughout the class is to show some of the primary sources. I'd like to share a thought from Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. To any of those who are familiar, Rabbi Luzzatto was a great halachist, a great Kabbalist, lived in the 1700s. A lot of the elementary works of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, are attributed to him. He made a lot, primarily Kabbalah is based on the Arizal, Lurianic Kabbalah. A lot of his writings are inaccessible except to a select few who are very knowledgeable and very versed. Whereas Rabbi Luzzatto wrote works that are much more, in Hebrew, the word would be shavel chol nefesh. They are much more available to everyone. So that's why I wanted to choose Rabbi Luzzatto here. And let me just pull it up here 1 second. Here we go. And again, this is the work Path of the Just from Rabbi Luzzatto. And he writes the following. Behold, what our sages of blessed memory have taught us is that man was created solely to delight in God and to derive pleasure in the radiance of the Shekhinah, the divine presence. For this is the true delight and the greatest pleasure that can possibly exist. The place of this pleasure is in truth in Olam Haba, the world to come, for it was created expressly for this purpose. But the path to arrive at this desired haven of ours is this world. This is what our sages of blessed memory said. This world is like a corridor before the world to come. And to many, this is very surprising. People think, well, if someone's the more observant, the more orthodox, you're only to praise God, to bring down godliness to the world. And while that's all true, however, that's not the essence. The essence why we're here is in order to derive spiritual pleasure. And the ultimate spiritual pleasure is that connection to God. And when it comes to pleasure, we have to define what the word pleasure means. Because if you look at secular society, lots of things are considered very pleasurable, whether it be food, whether it be vacations, whether it be romance, whether it be, there's lots of different things that may be positive and unfortunately some things that may be vices, may be negative. But if we want to define exactly what it is that Judaism looks at as joy, simcha, a mentor of mine once made the following statement, that hopefully, when I speak to college kids, this doesn't go well because they can't appreciate spiritual pleasure. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them are just looking for the fun right now. They want to go to the party. They want to have fun. They want to have, meet people, and they can't really look beyond that. But hopefully, as we've matured over the years, we realize that in reality, spiritual pleasures are really much greater. If you think about life cycle events, whether it be marriage, whether it be childbirth, right? Whether it be other milestones, those give us much more pleasure than physical pleasures. A physical pleasure, I don't know if you can see, but I'm a big guy. I enjoy steaks, and I can enjoy a good steak like the best of them. But at the end of the day, how long does that pleasure last for? It's there for a short period of time, and it's not there anymore. A mentor of mine once pointed out the Jewish concept of simcha, of true joy, is determined. The litmus test to find out what's joy is how do you feel the next day about it? How do you feel the next day? If a person does a truly great kind deed, you feel good about it for a while. You help someone out, you give charity, you get married. These are all things that are not just temporary. It's something that's much more lasting. And that being the case, compare that to a one-night stand, a good steak, going to the opera, a good sports game. There's nothing wrong with any of these things, and they're all great. But we have to differentiate intrinsically. There's a difference between a temporary pleasure and something that's going to last longer. How do I feel the next day? And that is, so to speak, I guess the proof I would use that really spiritual pleasure is really a much, much greater pleasure. If we now think about all the spiritual pleasures we had, again, it could be a marriage, it could be birth of a child, birth of a grandchild, fill in the blank, right? And by the way, spiritual doesn't have to mean religious. Spiritual could also mean music. Also, it's possible. It can mean other things. But the point is, the definition of spirituality is something above and beyond something temporary that I'm enjoying right now. That's the definition of spirituality. In fact, a whole different class is that really spirituality could be independent of religion. We'll keep that aside for a second. But the idea really is that spiritual pleasures are that much greater than physical pleasures because they're not temporary. The ultimate spiritual pleasure a person can possibly have is that eternal connection with God. We are here not only to serve God, we are here not only to make God's name greater, because that sounds like we're only here for someone else. But really, according to Luzzatto, and again, this is really a basis of Kabbalah, is that God's essence is to give and to be good and to give to others. And essentially, the biggest gift God can give to anyone is to allow that person to become godlike. Right? God could have made us all good, but we wouldn't become intrinsically godlike. But giving us the opportunity in this world to do good and become godlike, and then be able to connect to God, that is the ultimate pleasure that a person can possibly have in this world. And again, take a look at the spiritual pleasures you've had. And that is what, as Luzzatto writes, and we have to be very careful the way he writes this. And he says over here that for the sages have taught us that man was created solely to delight in God and to derive pleasure in the radiance of the Shekhinah. For this is the true delight and the greatest pleasure that can possibly exist. The place for this pleasure is in truth the world to come. But again, in truth, essentially the world to come. But the point is that we can taste it in this world as well. When we do acts of kindness, we do acts of charity, acts of prayer, acts of Torah study, or any of these things, we can tap into what that ultimate pleasure really is. So when we talk about life, what life really is about, the purpose of life is not to serve others, but rather for us to derive spiritual pleasure. And in fact, I think that when I say this, the last time I said this, Rabbi Schiff said, Rabbi, do you really believe that? And I said, absolutely. And I'll bring you another proof. If I had to ask anyone here, and again, you don't have to answer if you want, but if someone wants to answer, what was God's first commandment to Adam when he was created? What was the first commandment? Anyone want to chime in?
Name the animals.
Name the animals. Okay. What was that? That's something that Adam did, but an express commandment. What was the first express commandment? God brought the Midrash says that God brought him the animals, but there wasn't an express commandment. What was the first commandment? Although, Joe, that is a good guess. Okay. The most common answer people say is don't eat from the Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowledge. That's the most common answer given. However, though, it's mistaken, because if you look at the verse preceding it, God stated that from all of the trees of the garden you can eat, and only from the tree of knowledge you can't eat. And this changes really how we look at the world. That some people look at the Torah with its prohibitions is that God is trying to tell us what not to do. But that's not the case at all. Really, God wants us to enjoy everything. And in fact, have from all of the trees, and just from this one don't have. That in Judaism, we don't shun anything, whether it be eating, whether it be sexuality, whether it be any physical pleasure, but rather it's directed to a more spiritual sense. The definition of spirituality is when we take something physical and we raise it up beyond our instant gratification. That's the core of what Judaism is, and that's the purpose of life. When we now understand this, we can now segue into what death is and understand how death is not independent and different than life, but rather it's a continuation of the same thing. Okay. So and just to really sum this up, just to really conclude just this little section, as the verse there states in Genesis, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. And that mankind, man and woman, is formed from both physicality, both the earth, which is something that is physical, something that is heavy, something that is slow, but also God blew into our nostrils the breath of life. That is the concept of the neshama, that is the soul. Mankind is a hybrid of both physical and spiritual. The purpose of life is to have the spiritual guiding the physical while we're on this earth. Okay, I'll pause for a second. If there's any questions or comments, now would be a good time just before we go over to the next section. Anything? You can either type or chime in. Okay, fair enough. So the question is, well, hey, wait a second. What exactly, even before we get into what happens after we die, what is Judaism's philosophy on death? Is it something we're supposed to think about? Is it something that's supposed to be on our minds? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How do we harness it? How do we look at this? So I'd like to look at two different primary sources. The first one here is a midrash in Parshas Kedoshim, that's in Leviticus, chapter 8, section number 1. And the verse there says the following. It's referring to when the Jews would enter the land of Israel and they would be able to go ahead and plant trees and, get the fruits. When you come into the land and plant, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Israel, even though you find it full of all bounty, you shall not say, let us settle down and not plant. Rather, be careful in planting, as stated, and plant any tree for food. Just as you came in and found plantings which others had planted, so you shall plant for your children. Lest someone say, since I'm old and tomorrow I shall die, why should I toil for others? Solomon said, he has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also put eternity into their heart. Hidden is what is written. Why? The Holy One, blessed be he, had not hidden the day of one's death from people, a person would neither build nor plant. For he would have said, tomorrow I shall die. Why should I persist in toiling for the sake of others? The Holy One, blessed be he, therefore hid death from human hearts so that we'd be able to build and plant. And this is a very important thing here. Typically, most people when they're young have no thought of death. I think this is very clear, during COVID, where people that were younger were unfortunately taking some pretty serious risks, with COVID, and not realizing that they're not immortal. I think most teenagers think they're immortal. But in reality, God did that specifically. We're not supposed to be thinking about death. Why is that? Because very simply, if a person was always thinking that I'm going to die one day, why would they even accomplish? Why would I do for myself? Why would I do for others? And therefore, the Medrash tells us that no, that while death is important, it's not something we're supposed to harp on. It's not something we're supposed to constantly think about. Because if a person constantly thought about, hey, wait, I'm only going to be here for X amount of time, right? The person would lose a lot of motivation to build, to cultivate, and to grow. However, Ethics of the Fathers mentions another point as well, and that is the following. In chapter 3, Mishnah number 1, Kabir ben Mahal said, mark well 3 things, and you will not come into the power of sin. Know from where you come, and where you are going, and before whom you are destined to give an account and reckoning. From where do you come? From putrid drop. Everyone comes from a drop of sperm. Where are you going? To a place of dust, of worm and maggot. And before whom you are destined to give an accounting and reckoning? Before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. So over here, at the very end of this Mishnah, it points out that there is an element, though, of thinking about death and realizing that after a person does go on, that a person's supposed to think that everyone's home is going to be a place of dust. And that's in order to humble us and that we shouldn't be over materialistic. And yet also to realize that we're going to have to give a reckoning for each and everything we've done in this world. So again, I put down these 2 sources intentionally because they each temper each other. The first source points out, yes, on the one hand, we're not supposed to overly think about death so much, right? Why? Because that would paralyze us. Yet on the other hand, at moments to realize, though, thinking about death will be helpful in order to guide us in the proper way. Again, not to overdo it, but yet still there is a concept, though, of thinking about death. Okay. Before we get to even, what happens when a person dies, the first thing is to talk about really burial. And clearly, over the last 30 to 40 years, cremation has become much more popular. And many feel that it's better for the environment, which I've read studies that it's not the case because it takes so much fuel to actually burn a body that it's not actually better for the environment. And many people think, oh, I could bring my loved one anywhere. But from Jewish perspective, cremation is not permitted. A person has to be buried. As the verse very clearly states in Genesis, the verse there says, and the dust returns to the ground as it was. I'm sorry, Ecclesiastes, I apologize. And the dust returns to the ground as it was, and the life breath returns to God who bestowed it. And similarly in Genesis, it states, by the sweat of your brow shall you get bread to eat until you return to the ground. For from it you were taken, from dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So very clearly that the Torah here is advising for a person to be buried. Now, why is that important? As we'll get to it soon, because A, there's a concept of an afterlife, that death is not the end, but rather it's just really the next step. As we pointed out from the sources earlier, that mankind is a hybrid of body and soul. Death is merely a separation in which the soul goes back to heaven and the body stays below. However, Judaism believes in an absolute resurrection at the end of days, and that people will be reunited with their bodies. Therefore, it's important not to destroy the body, number one. Number two, as we'll get to later on in the sources, that the soul for X amount of time is intimately aware of what's going on in the world. The soul clearly knows. We'll see soon the Talmud debates whether it's fully involved the first couple days or really until the body decomposes, but it's very clear the soul is intimately aware of what's going on in the world, right? And therefore, imagine, how would a soul feel? You know, death is probably the most disorienting experience in the entire world. To see that body, which the person identifies with, to be burned is extremely hard for the soul to bear. So while on the one hand, according to Jewish law, one cannot cremate a body, but there's very good reason for it. Number one, because in the end we will be resurrected. And number two, because it will be so painful for the soul to see that body being cremated. And again, those are two of the possible reasons why we can't go ahead and cremate. And therefore, there should be a concept of Jewish burial. Okay. So one of the things I've mentioned numerous times here is the concept of after a person does die, there is an afterlife. Now, the question really is, well, how do we know about the afterlife? So I'm going to go through a number of different sources. And even before we go through these sources, I think especially with Shavuot being tomorrow night, just to kind of go through a little bit of what sources are. When we talk about the Chumash, the Bible, those are the 5 books of Moses. And that's what essentially Jews were given at that point. When Moses at Sinai was given the 10 Commandments, and at that point we were at the end of the desert, at the end of the 40 years, that's when we're given the 5 books of Moses. Along with the Torah, along with the Bible, was an oral translation and an oral explanation on that, because many of the things in the Torah are not really, so clear. That was something that was given over from teacher to student, from Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and that's something that was constantly passed on orally from teacher to student until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 Common Era. That at that point, when the Jews realized there was no longer a central rabbinic court to keep all of the laws clear, right? So therefore, they started putting things into writing, first in the Mishnah and later on in the Gemara. And a lot of our sources do come from there. Additionally, I'm sure many are familiar with the Zohar and other works of Kabbalah. The word Kabbalah does not mean mysticism. The word Kabbalah, in fact, means to receive. It's the tradition that was received from teacher to student, teacher to student. And the Kabbalah is the more of the esoterical and mystical traditions. And a lot of that work has been expanded upon in later generations. So other than the Talmud, which clearly is our most primary source, we get also works of Kabbalah, one of them being Das Tivunos, which means the knowing heart or the knowing understanding by Lutzato, as well as there's another primary source called Leshem Shabo V'Achlama, or by Elyashiv, that was written in the early 1900s. Those are some of the later sources which give us a little bit more details as to exactly what's going to occur. But before we even go through what happens, again, we'll get there, don't worry. But how do we know that there is a concept of an afterlife? So if we take a look, we can look very clearly. There are quite a few sources, both in the Bible as well as in the Talmud. So firstly, in Genesis chapter 25, verse 8, the verse there states the following: when Abraham died, and Abraham breathed his last, dying at a good ripe age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his kin. Right? Va'ye'esof el amav is the Hebrew words. He was gathered to his nation. What exactly does it mean he was gathered to his nation? What does that mean? The Talmud tells us what that means is he was gathered to the world of souls, where a person will connect with the rest of his nation. That people, even after they die, the soul does live on, the soul still does connect. And in fact, the Kabbalistic works write that the closer a person was with another person in this world, that's how close they will be in the world to come as well, in the world of souls, which we'll get to, which means spouses obviously will have a stronger connection. That is one of the sources from the Bible. That's Genesis chapter 25, verse 8. Next, in the Talmud and Sanhedrin on page 90b, the Talmud relates, the Gemara relates, Queen Cleopatra asked Rabbi Meir a question. She said, I know that the dead will live, as it is written, and may they blossom out of the city like grass of the earth. And that's a quote from Psalms chapter 72, verse 16. And just even before we see the rest of this source, it's important to know that in Kabbalah, in mysticism, there's a concept that any spiritual force or any spiritual entity, there has to be some type of physical example or representation in order to connect with it. Because if something was absolutely spiritual, we'd have no way of connecting with whatsoever. Everything spiritual has some type of, I don't know if the right word is example, or some type of something similar, which is physical. And the Maharal, one of the great rabbis of the 17th century, pointed out that the way that we can believe and understand and relate to the resurrection of the dead is that just like when you take a seed and you put it into the ground and then you water it, what happens? The seed starts to decompose. And only once it's fully decomposed, that's when it can start sprouting. And that's when it can grow into a flower, into a bush, into whatever it is you are creating. So too also with human life, it's the same thing. You bury the body for a time, but afterwards it'll come to life. And again, while it's not a direct analogy, but at least in some way we see how physicality can rot away and then become something much greater. So that's the verse in Psalms that Queen Cleopatra quoted to Rabbi Meir. And then she continued and asked the following question. Just as grass grows, so too the dead will come to life. But when they arise, when they are arise from the dead, will they arise naked or will they arise with their garments? That was Queen Cleopatra's question. Rabbi Meir said to her, it is derived from a logical deduction from wheat. If wheat, which is buried naked, meaning that the kernel is sown without the chaff, emerges with several garments of chaff, all the more so will the righteous who are buried with their garments arise with their garments. And in fact, many of the Kabbalists take this source of the Talmud to say that even if a person died with a certain handicap or disability, the person and the ultimate resurrection will come back to life in full physical health in their younger years as well, in the optimal physical sense. So again, this first we quoted the verse in Genesis that Abraham was gathered to his kin. That also is representative or hinting to the fact that there is a world to come. Secondly, the Talmud relates that Queen Cleopatra, in fact, quoted a verse in Psalms, and that they blossom out of the city like grass of the earth. The same way that seeds decompose in the ground and then grow to something beautiful, so too also with the ultimate resurrection. And not only that, when the person is resurrected in the future, that person is resurrected with clothing. And again, the Kabbalists extend that to say that the person is represented in their optimal state of physical health. Additionally, even Benjamin Franklin's epitaph writes the following. Again, this is not his full epitaph. I just took a quote out of it. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author. And that's on Benjamin Franklin's epitaph, on his tombstone. And again, among religious people, the concept of resurrection was something that was very clear and very understandable, and something that people did believe in. And lastly, a quote from the Talmud in Shabbat, page 152b. Rabbi Avo said, everything people say before the deceased, he knows, meaning the deceased knows, until the tomb is sealed with the top stone, until the final stage of burying. Rabbi Hi and Rabbi Shimon, son of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, disagreed with regarding to the meaning of the statement. One of them said that the deceased is aware until the tomb is sealed with the top stone, which is referring to the covering of the grave. And one of them said that is until the flesh decomposes. And again, there's a debate in the Talmud and Shabbat exactly how much a soul is intimately aware. Now, again, we believe the soul lives on, and therefore the soul always will know generally what's occurring. But the question is, how much does the soul know with every little detail? And very clearly, the soul knows for sure, according to everyone, at least until the grave is sealed. And according to the second opinion, it's until the flesh decomposes. In fact, this is the reason why, according to Jewish law, one should not unnecessarily push off a burial, in that it's difficult for the soul to see the body in a state. And in fact, the Kabbalists mentioned that when the worms go through the body, that it pains the soul greatly. And that's why the importance of burial and a quick burial is something that is always recommended according to Jewish law. So again, very, very clearly here, we quoted sources both from the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, as well as from the Talmud, as expanded by the Kabbalists, for the concept of an afterlife, that death is not the final stop. It's just the next step or stage in a person's development or in a person's life. Now, I'm sorry, I'll just pause for a second before we go to the next little piece. I think there were some questions in the chat. Let me take a quick look here. So Steve asked a good question here, that on one hand we have to give a reckoning, but Isaiah also says that all of our righteous deeds are like filthy rags. I think that the way I would understand that is to give us a sense of humility, that some people will do certain things that are good and feel good about it and feel that they've kind of like covered everything they're supposed to do. I think that it's supposed to remind us that even if we think we're doing good, we should never kind of rest on our laurels. That's the way that I would understand it over that verse in Isaiah. Are there any other questions before I move on? It is very clear. Okay, so Rabbi Schon said it's very clear that for some period after physical death, the soul knows what's happening to the body. It is not very clear to me. Could you please explain? So what I pointed out was that we have our sources that from these sources explain that the soul knows. That the source in the Talmud in Shabbat over there very clearly pointed out the soul is very much aware. Now again, the Talmud is the compilation of the rabbinic teachings from back and forth. So if you want to ask me how to know the Talmud is true, that's a whole nother class, and we can go through that. But the given of this class is that, we believe, or at least I certainly believe 100% in the words of the Talmud. And the Talmud there does say, pretty clearly that everything people say before the deceased, he knows, right? In a debate, exactly how far that goes out. Okay, was there anything else there? 150, well, in 152b, in fact, I don't believe it was reconciled. I believe this was, in the Talmud, very often we do have debates in which there is not a final resolution or reconciliation. There seems to be actually debate among the two. The only way we'll slightly reconcile it is because, according to everyone, there is some degree of knowledge going on in the world. And I think the debate there is, when does the soul go from intimate knowledge of everything to only a more general knowledge? And just to really finish up that idea is that the concept also is that in the Jewish sense of mourning, there are different, according to Jewish law, there are different stages in mourning. The first 7 days are the most severe. That's when a person sits shiva. That's when a person, can't shave, can't do lots of things. Then until day 30, there's another set of restrictions, which are more lenient. And then from day 30 till the end of the first year, there's some restrictions, but much fewer restrictions than there were. And Kabbalistically, the concept behind the lessening of those restrictions is that how much the soul is here. We know, as we'll point out soon, that Gehenna, purgatory, I don't like using the word hell because we'll see soon it's not our definition of hell. Purgatory lasts for a maximum of 11 months. And afterwards, the deceased soul gets to enjoy and bask in the absolute light of God. So, and essentially, Kabbalistically, it's hard to call it physically, but more metaphysically, the body is still more connected, and slowly, after a person's death, the soul is less connected to the body. to the point that the Talmud states that after a year, the deceased are forgotten from the heart. Now, it doesn't mean we totally forget about them. It just means they're not on our mind as much. And that after the year, after a parent passes, at that point, while a person's still supposed to love the parent, think about the parent, but it's not really supposed to, there really is supposed to be a sense of moving on from it as well. And that's because the parent, him or herself, has in fact moved on to their next level. Okay. Continuing. Our ultimate final exam. I remember in high school, I went to Yeshiva University High School. There were certain teachers that gave the final exam, the same final exam every year. And we had a Masorah, we had a tradition where basically it was in junior year. They used to pass everyone, gave it to the incoming junior class. Everyone, got the questions. And it's interesting if that's permitted or not is a side point. It happens to be that if the teacher is aware of what's going on, it is permitted. Some teachers don't really care so much, or they don't mind getting the questions. But if the teacher doesn't know, then it could be actually halachically problematic. However, though, the most important exam we'll ever have is the final exam after a person passes on. What's our final exam? And the Gemara, the Talmud, and Shabbat tips us off to what that is. And it says the following. It's based on a verse in, I believe it's Isaiah. Hold on one second. Yeah, it's based on a verse on Isaiah. With regard to the same verse in Isaiah, Rabbah said, after departing from this world, when a person is brought to judgment, for the life he lived in this world, they say to him, in order of that verse, number one, most important question is not, were you religious? That wasn't the first question. The first question is, did you conduct business faithfully? Of the most important things, did you conduct business faithfully? Number two, did you designate times for Torah study? Number three, did you engage in procreation? Number four, did you await salvation? Number five, did you engage in the dialect of wisdom? And number six, or understand one's matter from another? And nevertheless, beyond all these, if the fear of the Lord is his treasure, yes, he is worthy. And if not, no, none of these accomplishments have any value. So let's take a look at it one at a time here. Number one, did you conduct business faithfully? The purpose of this world is in order to raise up the physical and to make it spiritual. That is the purpose of why we're here. A Jew is not only a Jew in the synagogue. A Jew is not only a Jew in the study hall, but a Jew is a Jew everywhere, no matter what the Jew does. There was once a story where a certain rabbi was called to be a character witness for one of his congregants that was accused of fraud. And he called his mentor. He didn't know what to do. He called his mentor and said, Rabbi, I have an Orthodox Jew, right? I have an Orthodox Jew that might have stole. What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to lie? What am I supposed to tell the judge? And his mentor said, can you please repeat that? He's like, yeah, I have an observant Jew. I think he might have stole. What do I say? And the rabbi said again, please repeat that. He said, what did I say wrong? An observant Jew in my congregation. He may have stole. What do I do? And his mentor, Rabbi Schwab, said to him, you told me he was an observant Jew. An observant Jew doesn't steal. The same way that an observant Jew keeps Shabbat, and the same way the Jew studies Torah, he doesn't steal. How can you call him an observant Jew? And again, everyone makes mistakes. We're not looking to cancel anyone here. But the point is, especially from this passage from Talmud and Shabbat over there, we see very clearly that the first question anyone's asked is, number one, did you engage in business honestly? Number two, did you set aside times for Torah study? That the Torah is our moral compass. As many have said, that when we pray, we speak to God. When we study Torah, God is speaking to us. If we want to know how to live, we have to hear God's message. And that will only come about through Torah study. Number three, did you engage in procreation? Did you try to have children? Now, all of the commentators point out, well, some people don't get married. Some people physically can't have children. Can we really hold these people liable? And the answer is no. What this means, either A, actually having children, trying to have children, or B, have you tried to help others have children, or have you tried to help children? Meaning, if a person can't physically have children, one way to be able to answer this question is if the person went ahead and helped poor families have children, or helped raise an orphan, or helped someone like that. So the point is that we're here to try to populate the world in a good way. So that can either mean through physically having children or by helping children. Number 4, did you await salvation? Did you await the days of the Messiah, right? Because again, we have to realize that our world is not in its perfect state. And only once the Mashiach, once the Messiah comes, then will it be in its proper state. Number 5, did you engage in the dialectics of wisdom? Did you try to understand the wisdom and beauty of the world? And number 6, did you understand one matter from another? Did you try to look at the world with a keen eye and try to derive wisdom from the world? And these are our 6 questions. These are the ultimate final exam. Now, there's actually another passage from the Talmud and Sanhedrin, which states, and again, it's already late, I'm just going to go through part of it, that the beginning of a person's judgment, he is judged only concerning matters of Torah, right? Meaning the person studied. And so how do we reconcile that contradiction? So some say that it's referring to that the passage in Sanhedrin is dealing with the person that has the ability to study Torah, whose person's intelligent. And that person, the first question is, did you study Torah? Whereas for the other passage in Shabbat, that's referring to someone that did not have the capacity to really study Torah in a significant way, and therefore the questions are different. Other rabbis resolve the contradiction a different way, and they say that the second passage in Sanhedrin is that while Shabbat discusses the 6 main questions, but in regards to the reward a person receives, it'll be commensurate with the amount of Torah study. Okay, I'll pause for a second, take some questions. There are a few of them over here. Okay, what time do we have till here?
We have till 10:50.
10:50. Okay, so I'm just gonna try to finish up right now quickly. If there's any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. When a person does die, there are 3 possibilities that can occur. Number 1, the person can be, if the person is purely righteous, then the person can be sent to Gan Eden, to paradise. Number 2, if the person has some good deeds, but has some things that weren't so great, he put into Gehenna, into hell. And number 3 could be reincarnation, which is the person really is missing merits. They can come down to the world in a different sort, in either as a person or something else. Gan Eden, paradise, is pretty obvious that if a person is purely righteous, they get to, again, bask in what is called the world of souls and connecting to God. Number 2, Gehenna, hell or purgatory, is that for any good deed a person has ever done, that person will always be rewarded for it. However, if there is the spiritual baggage of sin, then in reality that person can't bask in the presence of God. Gehenna, hell, purgatory, which really is more like a hospital, is to cleanse the person of the negative baggage that the person has, right? And then after the person leaving purgatory can then get the proper reward from the mitzvah. Reincarnation is if a person really did not do their purpose in life, they can come down as either another person or another animal. Now, there's a great book called Many Lives, Many Masters, which discusses very clearly there's scientific evidence to reincarnation, both in the fact that sometimes people are born and they can speak languages that no one, from medieval times, or sometimes people are born with certain birthmarks and they connect to certain things. And those are the 3 things a person can have exactly after the judgment: paradise, hell, or reincarnation. And just to finish up the last minute or 2 here, and that in the order of things, after a person passes on, they go to the world of souls. And in the world of souls, that could be paradise, hell, or come back to the worlds of reincarnation. At one point, the Mashiach, the Messiah, will come, and the king and a descendant of King David will come and essentially bring down godliness to the world. And the Jews will be restored to the land of Israel. That will be a 40-year period. At the end of that 40-year period, then will be the resurrection of the dead, where all those that were dead will be brought back to life, which will lead into the world to come, which will be a person's eternal reward. The thoughts we've mentioned here are pretty weighty, and I hope that really everyone appreciated it. If there's any questions, if someone reach out to Federation, I'm more than happy to try to answer. But I really appreciate the audience was really great. I enjoyed the chats, the questions, and I'm really hoping, my thoughts and prayers are that we're able to gain a little bit more exactly what happens after a person does pass on.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I should call.
Thank you.
Should I take a question for a minute or two, or is it the next one starting like right now?
There's a-
Yeah, we are getting set for the next one. We need to put the.
No
host.
worries. Okay. Just
Thank
trying
you
to
so
help.
much.
A pleasure. Take care.
Yeah.